Gordon had walked a long road to reach the bazaar that morning. His boots were old and worn thin at the soles, and every step on the stone path sent a quiet ache up through his knees. He was not a young man anymore. The war had taken the best years of his body, and the years after the war had taken most of everything else. He had a small rented room at the edge of town, a thin blanket, a wooden chair, and a handful of coins that he kept in a cloth pouch tied to his belt. That was all he owned in the world. That was all he had left. The bazaar was loud and bright even in the early morning. Creatures of every kind moved through the wide dirt paths between the stalls. There were traders with scales and sharp eyes, and buyers with heavy purses and louder voices. Banners of red and gold hung from the tent poles, and the smell of roasted meat and sweet smoke drifted through the air. Gordon moved slowly through the crowd, not because he was looking for anything in particular, but because he had nowhere else to be. He had come to buy a small bag of grain and perhaps a bit of dried fruit if the price was kind. He passed stalls selling spell stones and iron tools and bolts of thick cloth. He passed a pen full of young horned goats and a table covered in bottled powders of every color. He nodded to a few faces he half recognized and kept walking. The crowd thinned a little near the far end of the bazaar, where the stalls were older and the banners were faded. This was the part of the market where things came to be forgotten. Old furniture missing a leg. Chip bowls. Tools with broken handles. Nobody came here unless they had very little money or very little pride, and Gordon had both. It was at the very back corner, half hidden behind a torn canvas sheet, where he heard it. A small sound. Not a cry exactly. More like the kind of sound something makes when it has already stopped expecting anyone to come. A low, dry scrape against wood. Gordon slowed his steps. He looked to the left and saw a row of cracked wooden crates stacked against a mud brick wall. The crates had air holes punched into the sides. Inside each one was a dragon hatchling. Gordon had seen dragons before. Everyone in this part of the world had. The great ones flew overhead sometimes, casting wide shadows over the fields. The elder dragons sat in their stone towers and made their old laws and kept their old pride. Dragon hatchlings were usually kept close, protected fiercely, raised with great care. A dragon hatchling was considered something precious, something powerful. But not these ones. These hatchlings were the ones nobody wanted. Gordon could see it clearly just by looking at them. One was too small, its wings folded wrong against its back. Another had scales the color of ash and a horn that had cracked clean through at the base. A third lay very still in the far corner of its crate, its sides rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths, its green scales dull and pale. The trader sitting on a stool nearby barely looked up. He was a thin man with a bored face and a cup of something warm in his hands. A small wooden sign leaned against the crates. The price written on it was low. Very low. The kind of price that said these things have been here a long time and nobody has wanted them. Gordon stood there for a moment and just looked. The ash-gray hatchling in the middle crate lifted its head. It looked at Gordon with eyes that were steady and dark and very calm. It did not whimper. It did not scratch at the bars of the crate. It did not make any sound at all. It simply looked at him the way something looks at you when it has already made peace with being overlooked. There was a dignity in that look that Gordon recognized. He had worn that same look himself, sitting in waiting rooms after the war, holding papers no one wanted to read, asking for help no one wanted to give. He felt something move in his chest. He reached into the pouch at his belt and counted his coins without taking them out. He knew the number already. He had counted them that morning and the morning before that. There was enough for the grain. Enough for maybe 3 days of simple food. Not enough for anything extra. Not enough for anything beyond what he absolutely needed. He counted them again anyway. The gray hatchling was still watching him. Not hoping. Not asking. Just watching with those quiet dark eyes and that broken horn and all that small, tired dignity. Gordon let out a long, slow breath through his nose. He thought about his thin blanket and his wooden chair and his empty evening and the long walk home across the cold stone road. He thought about the war and the friends he had carried and the ones he had not been able to carry far enough. He thought about every time someone had looked at him and decided he was not worth the trouble. He untied the pouch from his belt. He walked over to the trader and put the coins down on the wooden table without saying anything grand or important. He just pointed at the gray hatchling in the middle crate and said in a plain and tired voice that he would take that one. The trader raised an eyebrow, shrugged, and opened the crate. The gray hatchling stepped out slowly and stood on the table and looked up at Gordon. Still calm. Still quiet. Still carrying that small and unbreakable dignity. Gordon held out his hand. The hatchling stepped onto it. And Gordon turned and walked back through the bazaar with empty pockets and something warm curled against his chest, and he did not look back at the stall or the crates or the bored trader or the sign with its low and lonely price. He just walked home. Gordon did not sleep well that night. He lay on his thin blanket with the gray hatchling curled against his side and stared at the ceiling of his small rented room. The hatchling slept quietly, its broken horn resting against Gordon's ribs, its breath coming in slow and even pulls. It was warm for such a small thing. Warmer than Gordon expected. He kept one hand resting lightly on its back, feeling the small rise and fall, making sure it was still breathing. He did not know much about dragon hatchlings. He did not know what they ate or how much they slept or what they needed to stay alive. But he had kept men alive in worse conditions with less to work with, and he told himself this was not so different. In the morning he fed the hatchling a little soft bread soaked in warm water and a few small strips of dried meat from his own ration. The hatchling ate slowly, but it ate. That was enough for now. Gordon watched it carefully, looking for signs of sickness or pain the way he used to watch his soldiers after a hard night. The hatchling looked back at him with those same calm dark eyes, and Gordon nodded once as if they had reached some kind of agreement. Then he put on his worn boots and walked back to the bazaar. He told himself he was only going for grain. He told himself he was not going back to that back corner behind the torn canvas. He told himself he had done enough and spent enough and that whatever was left in those crates was not his responsibility. He told himself all of this very clearly and very firmly the entire walk there. He went straight to the back corner anyway. The trader was already on his stool with his cup of something warm. He looked up when Gordon appeared and said nothing, just watched with mild curiosity. Gordon looked at the crates. 2 were still there. The cracked wooden crates with the air holes punched in the sides. He stepped closer and looked inside the first one. A white hatchling lay curled in the corner. It was small and very still. Its scales were pale as old bone and its eyes were closed. Gordon watched it for a moment and then made a small sound with his tongue against his teeth, the kind of sound a person makes when they already know what they are going to do and are just catching up to themselves. He looked closer at the hatchling's face. The eyes did not move under the lids the way sleeping eyes do. They were too still. He reached 2 fingers gently through the air hole and touched the side of its small head. The hatchling flinched very slightly and turned its face toward the touch, but the eyes did not open. Gordon understood then. The eyes would not open. Not because she was sleeping. Because she could not see. He looked at the second crate. The tiny green hatchling inside was in a worse state than the night before. It was lying flat on its side, its small chest pulling in hard shallow breaths, its legs barely moving. It was the color of old leaves, dull and faded, and it was very clearly running out of time. Gordon stood up straight and looked at the trader. The trader named a price for both. It was low, the same kind of low as before, the kind of price that expected no argument because no one in their right mind would want these 2. Gordon reached into his pouch and counted out the coins. It was almost everything he had left. What remained after this would not buy much. A few days of food at most. He counted the coins a second time, not because he had miscounted but because some part of him was still trying to find a reason to stop. He put the coins on the table. He carried both crates home in one trip, one under each arm, the gray hatchling walking alongside him on the ground, keeping pace with short careful steps as if it understood something important was happening. Back in his room, Gordon set the crates down and opened them both. He worked quickly and quietly the way he had learned to work in the field, where speed and calm mattered more than anything else. He rolled his spare shirt into a thick pad and placed the white hatchling on it near the warmest corner of the room. He checked her breathing. It was shallow but steady. He warmed a little water and offered it to her on 2 fingers. She turned toward his hand and drank slowly. Good. The green one was harder. Its breathing was wrong, catching and stopping and catching again. Gordon had seen that before. Wet lungs, maybe, or something close to it. He heated a small pot of water until it steamed and held the green hatchling near the steam, not too close, just enough for the warm damp air to reach its chest. He did this for a long time, refilling the pot twice, until the breathing began to slow into something more even. The hatchling did not open its eyes, but it stopped fighting for each breath. Gordon took that as a small victory. Word moved through the bazaar the way word always moves through small places. By afternoon 2 elder dragons had come to stand outside his door. They were large and old, and they looked at Gordon with a particular expression that powerful creatures wear when something small confuses them. One of them said that what he was doing was pointless. That the hatchlings were flawed and weak and had been left for good reason. That he was wasting his time and his money on things that would not survive. Gordon looked at the elder dragon for a long quiet moment. Then he said in a plain and level voice that no one should die forgotten. He stepped back inside and closed the door. 3 weeks passed and Gordon's pouch stayed empty. He had known it would come to this. He had done the counting in his head the morning he brought the second two hatchlings home, standing in his small room with the coins laid out on the floor in a careful line. He had looked at the numbers and understood exactly what they meant. It was not a complicated sum. What he had would not last long. What he needed to keep 3 sick hatchlings alive cost more than what a retired veteran with no work and no family received at the end of each month. The gap between those two numbers was wide and getting wider every day. So Gordon made adjustments. He had learned to adjust in the war. Every soldier did. You learned to take less and make it stretch further and tell yourself you were not hungry when you were. You learned to sleep light and work hard and find small ways to hold things together when everything around you was trying to fall apart. Those skills did not leave a man just because the war ended. They lived in the body long after everything else was gone. Gordon pulled them out now the way he used to pull out old tools from the bottom of a pack. Worn but still useful. He cut his own meals in half first, then to a third. He ate once a day in the evening, something small and plain. Bread mostly. Sometimes a little soup if he had the means to make it. He told himself he was not hungry. Some mornings he almost believed it. The important thing was that the hatchlings ate. He made sure of that before anything else. Every morning he prepared their food first and watched them eat before he considered anything for himself. The gray hatchling had grown a little. Not much but enough to notice. It moved with more confidence now, stepping carefully around the small room as if learning the edges of its new world. Gordon had started calling it Ash without really deciding to. It had simply happened one evening when he was watching it stand very still near the door, its broken horn catching the last light through the window, and the name had come out of him quietly and naturally, and Ash had turned its head at the sound as if it had always known that was its name. Ash had developed a habit that made Gordon smile every single night without fail. When the sun went down and the room grew dark, Ash would walk to the door and sit in front of it. Straight-backed. So alert. It would stay there through the night, watching the door the way a sentry watches a gate. Gordon would wake sometimes in the small hours and look across the dark room and see that small gray shape sitting at the door, completely steady, completely focused, and something in his chest would go tight and warm at the same time. He had trained soldiers who held their post with less dedication than that small broken-horned hatchling. He named the white one Pearl. She had settled in well despite everything. She could not see but she was not lost. She used sound and smell and touch with a sharpness that surprised Gordon every day. She always knew where he was in the room. She turned toward him before he spoke, tracking his footsteps with her ears, tilting her pale head at small sounds he could barely hear himself. She was gentle and quiet and she liked to press her head against Gordon's hand when he sat still long enough. He gave her that whenever he could. The green one was the one that worried him. Gordon had named him Pip because the name suited him. Small and bright and stubborn in the way that only very small things can be stubborn. Pip had improved in those first days, but the improvement had slowed and then stopped. His breathing was better than it had been in the crate, but it was still not right. There was a sound to it sometimes, a faint wet catch deep in the chest that Gordon did not like. He had heard that sound before in men after long cold nights in the field, and he knew it did not go away on its own without the right kind of help. He needed a healer. He had been putting it off because healers cost money and money was the one thing he did not have. But Pip's breathing had been worse for 3 nights in a row and Gordon was not willing to wait any longer. He asked the woman who ran the grain stall at the edge of the bazaar if she knew of anyone. She thought for a moment and then mentioned a dragon healer named Ren who sometimes came through the area and charged less than most because she believed healing was not something that should only belong to those with full purses. Ren arrived the following afternoon. She was not what Gordon expected. She was younger than him, with careful eyes and steady hands, and she carried a worn leather bag that clinked softly when she moved. She stepped into Gordon's room and stopped. She looked at the 3 hatchlings. She looked at Gordon. She looked at the room with its bare walls and single blanket and the small pot on the cold stove. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she set down her bag and got to work. She checked all 3 hatchlings with quiet thoroughness. When she got to Pip she was careful and slow, listening to his chest for a long time with a small hollow tube she pressed against his scales. Gordon stood nearby and watched her face. Her expression did not change but her eyes grew a little more focused in the way that told him she was hearing what he had been hearing. When she finished she straightened up and looked at Gordon. She told him the hatchlings were alive because of him. She said that plainly without decoration. She said she wanted to pay him for the care he had clearly given them and that she could see what it had cost him just by looking at his face. Gordon shook his head once. He told her he did not need payment. He asked her only one thing. He asked her to check Pip's lungs properly and tell him what needed to be done. Ren looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read. Then she nodded and opened her bag again. The months that followed were quiet ones. Gordon's room was still small and still bare and the blanket was still thin. But the room felt different now. It felt lived in. It felt like something was growing inside it the way things grow in quiet places when they are given just enough light and just enough warmth and just enough time. The three hatchlings filled the space with small sounds and small movements and small moments that Gordon had not known he was missing until they arrived. He watched them every day the way he used to watch young soldiers finding their footing. Carefully. Patiently. Without pushing. He had learned long ago that the worst thing you could do for something still finding its strength was to rush it. You gave it time. You gave it safety. You gave it enough food and enough warmth and enough steadiness and then you stepped back and let it become what it was going to become. He had not expected what they became. Ash changed first. It started one evening when a stray dog wandered too close to the open window and sent Pearl skittering backward in alarm. Pearl was not often frightened but the sudden smell and sound of the dog had caught her off guard and she pressed herself into the corner trembling in that quiet way she had, not making a sound but shaking from her nose to the tip of her tail. Gordon moved toward her but before he got there Ash was already standing between Pearl and the window. Ash did not hiss. Did not scratch. Did not make any of the sharp warning sounds young dragons usually made when they felt threatened. Instead Ash opened its mouth and let out a sound that Gordon had never heard before in his life. It was low. Very low. So low he felt it more in his chest than heard it with his ears. It rolled through the room like the deepest note of a very old bell, slow and steady and even. It was not loud. It did not shake the walls or rattle the pot on the stove. It was simply deep and round and completely calm, and it moved through the air like a warm hand placed gently on a frightened shoulder. Pearl stopped trembling. The dog outside went quiet. Gordon stood very still in the middle of the room and felt the sound pass through him and noticed, with some surprise, that his own heartbeat had slowed. Ash closed its mouth. Looked at Pearl. Then looked at Gordon with those steady dark eyes as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Gordon sat down slowly on his wooden chair and thought about that for a long time. Over the following weeks Ash did it again. Twice when a storm rolled in and rattled the shutters. Once when a loud argument broke out in the street below and set all three hatchlings on edge. Each time the same sound. That deep slow resonance rolling out of Ash like something ancient and certain, and each time everything it touched grew still and calm. Gordon began asking around quietly, describing what he had heard to the few dragon-knowledgeable people he trusted. Every one of them gave him the same look. A look that said they did not believe him. Because what he was describing was not something dragons did. There was no record of it. No name for it. It had simply never existed before. Pearl surprised him differently. She had always been sharp with her nose and her ears. Gordon had known that from early on. But somewhere in those quiet months her sharpness had grown into something that went far beyond what he could explain. She began finding things. Small things at first. A button Gordon had dropped behind the stove. A piece of dried meat that had rolled under the far edge of the blanket. She would lift her pale head, turn it slowly, and walk directly to whatever was lost without a single moment of uncertainty. Then bigger things. One afternoon Gordon could not find the small key to the wooden box where he kept his few important papers. He had looked everywhere twice. Pearl walked to him, pressed her nose briefly against his hand, turned and walked to the far corner of the room, and sat down next to a crack in the base of the wall where the key had slipped through and landed in the hollow space below. Gordon had to use a thin stick to fish it out. He looked at Pearl for a long time afterward. Pearl turned her pale face toward him and tilted her head and said nothing because she never said anything. She simply knew things. She simply found them. Wren came by to check on Pip that same week and Gordon told her about Pearl's ability. Wren listened carefully and then went very quiet in the way she did when something was working hard inside her mind. She said she had never heard of any dragon with tracking ability even close to that level. She said the elder dragons she knew could track reasonably well. But not like this. Not with this kind of certainty. Not at this distance. Pip was the last to show himself and the most startling of the three. He was still small. He would probably always be small. His green scales had brightened considerably since those first frightening nights and his breathing had cleared almost completely thanks to Wren's medicines and Gordon's steady care. He moved quickly now, darting around the room with a restless energy that made Gordon smile and occasionally step carefully to avoid standing on him. But it was his mind that was the real thing. Gordon had started leaving simple puzzles for all three hatchlings. Knotted cords. Latched boxes with treats inside. Small stacked objects that needed to be moved in the right order. He had done it first out of boredom and then because he could see it kept them busy and happy. Ash solved things slowly and with great patience. Pearl found solutions through smell and instinct. Pip took one long look at whatever was placed in front of him, sat very still for a moment that always felt just slightly too long, and then solved it. Every time. Faster each time. The knotted cords took him less than a minute. The latched box he had opened before Gordon had fully set it down. One afternoon Gordon built the most complicated stacking puzzle he could manage with the objects in his room and set it in front of Pip and stepped back. Pip looked at it, tilted his small green head to one side, then the other, then moved through the solution in 7 clean unhurried steps without a single mistake. Gordon sat back in his wooden chair and let out a long slow breath. He thought about that back corner of the bazaar. The cracked crates, the low price on the sign. The elder dragons who had called these 3 broken and worthless and not worth the trouble of a second look. He looked at Ash sitting calm and steady by the door. At Pearl turning her face toward some distant thing only she could sense. At Pip already investigating the next object in the room with those quick bright eyes. Gordon shook his head slowly. Not broken, he thought. Just waiting. The elder council did not come quietly. There were 5 of them and they arrived on a cold clear morning when the sky was the color of pale stone and the air had that sharp clean smell that comes before the first frost of the season. Gordon heard them before he saw them. The sound of large wings and heavy landing and the deep settled weight of very old creatures touching the ground outside his door. He was sitting in his wooden chair drinking a cup of warm water with a little dried herb in it because that was all he had, and he looked up at the ceiling and then at the door and then at Ash who was already standing at the door in the usual spot. Completely still, completely alert. Gordon set down his cup and stood up. He opened the door. The 5 elder dragons filled the narrow street outside his small rented room the way mountains fill a horizon. They were old and enormous and their scales carried the dull deep colors of things that have existed for a very long time. The one at the front was the largest. Its eyes were pale gold and very steady and it looked at Gordon with an expression that was difficult to read, not unkind but not warm either. The expression of something that has lived long enough to be careful about what it feels. Behind Gordon, Ash stepped forward and stood at his left side. Pearl appeared at his right, her pale face lifted, reading the air. Pip climbed up onto Gordon's shoulder and sat there looking out at the elder dragons with small bright eyes that missed nothing. The largest elder spoke. It said the council had been watching. It said they had sent Ren originally not just as a healer but as someone who could observe and report back honestly. It said what Ren had reported had been discussed at length among the eldest and most learned dragons in the territory. It said what the 3 hatchlings had developed under Gordon's care was without precedent. Ash's resonance. Pearl's tracking. Pip's reasoning. None of it should have been possible. None of it had ever been recorded. And the council had spent a great deal of time trying to understand how a human veteran in a bare room with almost no resources had managed to produce what generations of dragon tradition and dragon knowledge had failed to produce in 3 hatchlings that everyone had agreed were beyond saving. Gordon listened to all of this without speaking. Then the elder said the council wished to offer recompense. It used that word carefully and formally the way old powerful things speak when they are trying to say something that does not come easily to them. It said there was gold. A significant amount. Enough to buy a proper house and live comfortably for the rest of his years. There were also titles. Formal recognition within dragon society, a thing offered to no human in living memory. Honors that would carry his name forward long after he was gone. Gordon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the elder. Then he looked down at Ash standing steady at his side. He looked at Pearl with her face turned slightly toward the wind. He looked at Pip on his shoulder, who was currently studying the largest elder dragon with the focused curiosity of someone taking careful notes. Then Gordon spoke. He said he did not need a large house. He said titles were kind but not something he had ever known what to do with. He said there was only one thing he wanted and it was not for himself. He said there were more hatchlings in that bazaar. There were more in other bazaars in other towns. Hatchlings in cracked crates with low prices on signs, left there because they were not perfect enough or powerful enough or the right color or the right size. He said he wanted a place for those ones. A proper place. Warm and clean and large enough to hold more than 3. Staffed by people who understood that broken did not mean worthless and that forgotten did not mean without value. He said if the council wanted to give him something then that was the only thing he would accept. The large elder looked at him for a long time. Then it said yes. The sanctuary took shape over the following months on a wide piece of ground at the edge of town where the morning light came in long and warm through the eastern windows. Gordon was involved in every detail. He knew what those hatchlings needed because he had learned it in one small room with 3 of them and very little else. He knew they needed warmth and quiet and steadiness. He knew they needed someone who would not look at them and see what was missing but would simply look at them and stay. He made sure all of that was built into the place from the ground up. Ren came to help run it. She brought 2 others with her, young healers with careful hands and patient eyes, and Gordon trusted them because he had watched Ren work and he knew what she was made of. On the evening the sanctuary was finished, Gordon walked back to his small rented room for the last time. He had been offered a room in the sanctuary itself, a proper one with a real bed and a window that faced the garden. He had accepted it without argument because his knees were worse than they had been and the walk from the old room was long. He built a small fire in the garden that first night. Just a modest one, enough for warmth and a little light. He sat in front of it on a low wooden bench with his cup of warm water and he looked at the flames and listened to the quiet. Ash came first. Walked out of the dark and lay down against Gordon's left side, that broken horn resting against his arm, warm and solid and completely calm. Pearl came next. She found him the way she always found him, without sight, without effort, following whatever invisible thread connected her to him. She curled across his feet and tucked her pale nose under her tail. Pip arrived last, tumbling out of the shadows with his usual energy, turning 2 quick circles before settling across Gordon's lap and going immediately and completely still in the way he always did when he had decided something was exactly right. Gordon sat there with the fire in front of him and 3 dragons around him and the night quiet and wide in every direction. He had no gold in his pockets. He had no title on his door. He had a worn blanket and old boots and knees that ached in the cold and a cup of plain warm water and a small fire on a piece of ground that now belonged to the ones nobody wanted. The Elder Council had a word for what Ash and Pearl and Pip had chosen. Bethkara, the chosen hearth. It meant something deeper than loyalty. It meant you have looked at every other place in the world and you have chosen this one. It meant you have looked at every other person and you have chosen this one. It was considered the most sacred bond in dragon culture, older than any law, older than any title, and it could not be given or bought or arranged. It could only happen on its own when it was true. Gordon did not know all of that on that first night in the garden. Ren told him later. When she did he was quiet for a long time. Then he looked down at Pip asleep on his lap and at Pearl still and warm across his feet and at Ash solid and steady against his side. An old soldier with empty pockets. The fullest heart in the room.